The life of a captain was often a privileged one, but for the men who crewed the whaling ships, their standard of living and their lives at sea proved to be radically different.
Each vessel would carry a complement of men not only to work the sails and the rigging of the ship, but also to go out in small boats after whales, kill them, bring them back in, strip off the blubber, and render it down into oil. So you might have 1,500 plus men, maybe even 2,000 on the whaling vessels. At the height of the industry, you might have several hundred sailors roaming the streets looking for a good time. New London was notorious for having, grog shops along Water Street and Bank Street, Reed Street. There was Hell Hollow, which was the local red light district. The whaling merchants often encouraged sailors to have a good time, spend money. They would advance the money prior to the voyage. The sailors would be charged for loading the ship. They'd be charged for whatever advances they'd been given, and they'd work it off as they were on the vessel. It was in the interest of the owners to actually have the sailors start out the voyage in debt to them. The captains would be paid a share, or what was called a lay, in the voyage. In fact, each member of the crew, the officers and so forth, would get this lay or share. A captain's lay might be as much as, say, a 12th, a 16th. A green hand or a Portuguese from the Azores or something else, they might be signed on for 195th or 175th.
After a couple of years at sea, with a wage advance and with the debts run up through purchases at the ship's store, known as the slop chest, many crew members would be left in debt or with maybe $30 or $40. Life at sea was no leisure cruise.
A lot of whalemen, when they first went to sea in the whaling industry, had great ideas of seeing the world and what a romantic kind of a opportunity it was to go on the high seas and capture the great Leviathan. But if you read a lot of the journals in the libraries around the state and elsewhere, you'll see that after a few months, most of these crewmen became very disillusioned with the whole business.
I traveled far out in the ocean, hunting and searching for whales. But now I've returned to Old Mystic, so listen and heed this sad tale. So listen and heed this sad tale. So listen.
There was a lot of time on board these whaling ships that went on voyages for 2, 3, 4 years at a time. And life in the forecastle could be cramped and sometimes a little bit unhealthy. It was just not a great life after a few months for most of these seamen. There were long periods of boredom and routine shipboard activity.
Keep your eye on the boats. On the other hand, when whales were sighted, you have extreme danger for a very short length of time. Hopefully you prevail, you bring the whale back. Now you've got a tremendous amount of work. So what the whaling merchants did was they relied on finding green hands, farm boys from far away, many of them not from New London, many of them from upstate New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. They also recruited Portuguese from the Azores, blacks from the Cape Verde Islands, people from St. Helena, Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic, Kanakas, South Sea Islanders, Hawaiians. There's a very strong Native American presence, Mohegans and Pequots both.
It's true that the maritime history of the United States has often been presented pretty much as a white man's story. The truth of the matter is, it was a very multicultural story, particularly in the early 19th century. Sometimes the early crew lists clearly indicate that a third of the crew were ethnic minority, folks of color. As the whaling industry became more marginalized in the late 19th century, even more and more blacks came into that fishery. By the turn of the century, in those whaling vessels that were still going out, sometimes half the crew or more were black.